of the New York Financial Writers Association. I'm very happy to have you all here for this very well-attended event. And that just goes to show how much respect and admiration there is for the guest of honor this evening, Andy Serwer. I'm going to turn this over now to Michael Paterakis, who is the chair of the selection committee, and a big thanks to him as well as the fellow committee members Lisa Kaplan, Deborah Turner, Greg Miles, Yong Lim, and Myron Kandel. Just one word before I give Michael the floor. Some of you are members, and we thank you for that. Those who aren't, join please. I'd love to have you. We put on a lot of great events. We just did one on pioneering women in journalism and their heirs, which featured two Fortune people, Carol Loomis and Allison Chantel. That was a Zoom event, and it was a huge success. And I give thanks to Olivia Carville for doing most of the recruiting of people for that. And we had an event shortly before that featuring Leonard Sloan, the veteran New York Times financial advice columnist, and as moderator of a panel featuring some of the best financial advice, personal finance columnists in New York. And it's just been one after another. We see that New York Financial Writers Association is not just the organization that puts on our annual fundraising event, the Follies, although that's important too, but and the Elliott Bell Award, which we're celebrating this evening. The Follies is going to be a week from Friday, and there are still a few seats available, only a few. So if you want one, talk to this lady right here in the front row. This is our Executive Director, Britt Tunick. Oh, one other thing I really should mention before we start is that the reason we had alcohol tonight, it's all Britt. This was not an easy task. She had to fight with the New York State Liquor Authority, with CUNY for weeks to get through the bureaucracy. And it wasn't until 7:30 this morning that she finally got the liquor license. So Britt. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone, for being here with us tonight. I'll try to be brief as well. I just want to say a few words about Andy and why we selected him, because the Elliott Bell Award, named in honor of the founding president of the New York Financial Writers Association, Elliott Valence Bell, whose career spanned like almost 60 years and many different roles. He was like a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune and the New York Times, and later he was like editor and publisher of Businessweek. This award is presented each year since 1976 to an outstanding journalist for a significant long-term contribution to the profession of financial journalism. Past recipients include legends of our industry, like Gretchen Morgenson, James B. Stewart, Alan Sloan, Leonard Sloan, Paul Steiger, and Carol Loomis, who's actually here with us tonight. And Andy perfectly fits that bill. In fact, like so perfectly that I can now reveal that twice in the past couple of years before winning this award, he lost it by a single vote. Yeah, yes. The committee recognized Andy not only for his 4 decades in the financial journalism space, most of which he spent leading and managing teams producing content on all possible mediums, print, audio, video, and of course, digital, but also for being a mentor to dozens of our colleagues. Case in point, there are about like 10 students in this room tonight from Andy's class at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. You guys are lucky. Andy currently serves as the top editorial executive for Yahoo Finance, one of the biggest business new platforms in the world with over 110 million monthly unique users. In this role, he has oversight of a team of approximately 100 individuals, distributing thousands of stories per day and creating hundreds of original pieces of content per week. Andy also hosts a weekly influencer video interview program with high-profile business leaders and writes columns and articles. Prior to joining Yahoo Finance in 2015, Andy spent almost a decade as managing editor of Fortune magazine, where he started as junior fact-checker out of graduate school back in 1980s. As the leader of the publication, he was responsible for overseeing Fortune's web and print editions with a combined audience of more than 13 million. He also served as anchor of CNN's flagship American morning TV program between 2000 and 2006. In supporting Andy's nomination, Myron Candell, a founding editor for CNN and the 1988 recipient of Elliott Bell, hey Mike, Mike said that Andy was a prize-winning writer and rose to become Fortune's managing editor. Along the way, he also was a major presence on TV. How he did all that always amazed me. Please join me in celebrating Andy Serwer as the 45th recipient of the Elliott V. Bell Award. Thanks very much. Andy, if you want to say a few words.
Thank you. Wow. I really can't believe I'm standing here. I'm very flattered and grateful. I really am. I'm kind of emotional too, and especially seeing these names here on the back here. It's really humbling, daunting, and these are all my mentors, all these people. I've worked with so many of these people, and Mike and Carol right there are two of them. I'm just really very, very, very proud to be in your company. And just, you know, what we do is a collaborative thing, journalism. So for all the people I work with at CNN and at Fortune, thank you. And in fact, thank you for all the people I work with at Yahoo as well. It's really just been a great ride, and it continues. And I especially want to thank Mike because, as this Mike said, I know you were instrumental in me getting this award, so thank you very much, Mike. I'm not sure why he cared so much, but he did, so I really appreciate it. We had a lot of fun working together at CNN, and that's really just one quick note before we get our great panel up here that I want to mention, and is having fun. And I always like to have fun, and a lot of people think that is at odds with doing great work, and I don't think it is at all. I really don't. And these are our lives, and so we can do really great work and have a really great work environment at the same time, and those are the best places to work. They really are. And so I think it's, you know, incumbent upon everyone to try to remember that that it's the accomplishment, the awards, but also we're all just trying to really, you know, have fulfilling careers and fulfilling lives as well. Also want to thank my students for coming down, some of them. Thank you guys. And then also most of all my family. One of my daughters is here, Katie, and then my brother Nick, and my wonderful wife, who many of you guys know, Pei King. So wonderful. Thank you. So with that, why don't we bring this panel up? Elizabeth and Vivek and Ben, come on up. So this, hot mics, careful. This panel, I think, was ostensibly about the future business model of business journalism, but that's just sort of roughly what it is. It's kind of just about everything. I mean, this is just an incredible group of people who, you guys know them, what they've done, and it's just a really, they just do so many interesting things. And so we'll just pick their brain. And so I'll ask them questions for a little while, and then you guys can ask questions. I mean, I think this is probably a pretty shy group. Right? So, what's that? Oh, yes, thank you for saying. This is being recorded.
Oh.
Okay? Is that all right, Ben?
Everything is being
I
recorded.
know,
I
exactly.
guess that's true.
Exactly, right, I know. That's so true. Like, no, nothing from this that's said here can be.
This is off the record,
Yeah,
guys.
this is off the record. Right, well, we'll talk about those kind of issues. Well, Ben, since you're chiming up, we'll go to you first. And, you know, everyone is asking Ben about Semaphore and his new endeavor. I don't know why you didn't call it the Smiths, right, or something like that. There's the band and the bar. I guess already have those names, so that's
It's
kind
too
of a problem.
maudlin,
Yeah,
the Smiths.
it is too maudlin, right?
Yeah, a
But
little too
anyway,
emo.
right, and so what are you trying to do? First of all, the name. But what are you trying to do, and how is it really differentiated? I mean, everyone asks you that, but we have to ask you that.
Well, thank you for having me. And I should say, like, that was a very, that was like you didn't think enough. I don't know. That was like you should have spent more time beating your chest up there. Like, congratulations. This is sort of a big award. I don't like. It's very in character. I think that you like very quickly say thank you and then just sort of turn to asking other people questions. But congratulations.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, and as usual, good question. And honestly, like I'm not, you know, it's not differentiated because it doesn't exist. To some degree, it doesn't exist, and I'm a little allergic to the sort of model of beating your chest about something that doesn't exist. And so I guess I would say, I mean, so I kind of am not gonna tell some big story. Like I hope you'll love it when you see it, and confident you will. I do think there are these big. You know, it's interesting. I think baked into that question a little is there's so much out there. Like, who needs a new thing? And the answer to that is obviously, like, have you ever talked to a consumer? And have you said, like, do you love everything? Like, it's great, right? Like, news landscape, you love it, it's perfect. No, everybody hates it. Like, obviously, you look at consumer research, you talk to anyone, and consumers are incredibly dissatisfied. And there are a lot of different sort of problems and expressed differently. It's hard to sort of pull out exactly what the threads are, but obviously people feel two big themes that I think we're interested in going at. People feel very, very overwhelmed by the quantity of news that they're getting. I loved and grew up, in a moment when people loved being flooded by a mix of news and entertainment and everything else in a kind of undifferentiated social media feed. I don't really think people are enjoying that anymore. And then they also don't know what to trust and sort of how to figure out what to trust and how to connect with particularly a kind of faceless brand. And so I think those are two of the things we're thinking about.
Okay, I'm sure follow-up questions. We'll hold that for 1 second. Unlike Ben, I've worked with Vivek and Elizabeth at Fortune. And also, speaking of one other person I forgot to mention is Hank Gilman, who I work with at Fortune. And the reason why I wanted to mention him is because he was the person who put me on the internet. And it was a quarter of a century ago when street life started. And so it was just sort of surprising to me that we're now talking about ancient history in digital media. Think about that, right? 25 years ago in the beginning, right? Hank said, you should do an online column. And of course I said, what's that mean? Right? It was unbelievable. And these guys are so well versed in that and steeped in it. Elizabeth, maybe the first thing, and I was just talking to you about this in the hall, is, what do you do and how do you describe where you sit in your career right now?
I feel like I might be a product of modern journalism in the most extreme way. I have like 8 jobs. I think maybe 14. I lose count. Among other things, I actually teach at NYU in the J School, and I teach a class on media innovation for Jay Rosen's Studio 20 program. But mostly in the last year, I've been writing a lot for the Times, most recently in opinion pieces. I do some political stuff. I still do media consulting, and perhaps relevant to this panel, I co-host Late Money with Felix Salmon and Emily Peck. So, and I have 4 other jobs that I'm just not even thinking about right now. But
that sounds like a lot. Right, cobbling things together, right?
This also, and this may be just endemic to me. I have, a lot of different interests in low attention span, but I also know many people who are, in my position where you're a mid-career journalist and you have a bunch of sort of disparate skill sets, and you want to utilize all of them. So you end up in this kind of strange career path where you try to pursue all of them at once, and in some level you are doing it, and you just have to figure out how to be in the media environment that we're in a new way.
A lot more to follow up with you as well. A founding editor of Gawker, an op-ed piece on Elon and Twitter in the New York Times recently. I want to ask you about all those things. But Vivek, over to you. And Vivek, you were a young rising star, I think, back in the 90s.
Yeah,
And
late
then
90s.
you became a CEO of an NYSE. Is it NYSE?
No,
NASDAQ, sorry. NASDAQ traded company. But Ziff Davis, CEO, the CEO. Carol, that kind of blows my mind that Vivek is the CEO of a publicly traded company, right? We didn't see that
Mine
coming,
too.
Vivek. Right, yeah, right. But so tell us a little bit about what you're doing and the
Yeah.
properties and how that works just very
Yeah,
quickly.
but before I do that, Ben's right. You're way too modest.
Stop it.
No,
Too modest for you to
I
continue.
spent 15 years at Time Inc. With Andy and Carol and Hank and Lee and other folks, and Andy was the first 5-tool player. He did it all. He did long form. He did short form. He would write. He would go on television. He would do web video. He would blog. He did a Street Life, a newsletter. He did it all. He worked with the business side. He went on sales calls. He understood we needed revenue to do what we were doing. So that was not typical in the mid-90s. It really wasn't. And it was, I think, an example for a lot of people who worked at Fortune and at Time Inc. And I think we did. We set, I think you set a lot of standards. So, I got to see this, really closely. And he's an extraordinary person. And I just think that, obviously overdue, 3 years, he lost by 1 vote, but finally came.
Now
And-
you know why we put Vivek on the panel.
No, but it's true, and we're here to celebrate you, so
Thank
I
you.
wanted to make
Thank
sure
you.
I said that. Just in terms of my own story, Ziff Davis is an interesting company. It's almost 100 years old. It's a 95-year-old company. Everyone knows it. Everyone sort of nods and feigns recognition, but the company has been through a lot of incarnations. And when I entered the scene, which was right after I left Time Inc., which was in 2010, the company was one of the early victims of the internet. It went bankrupt. And it was a function of the internet and a function of private equity. It had traded between SoftBank and Teddy Forsman and then Willis Stein, lots of debt. And so that debt would start to choke a company that couldn't service that debt, and it couldn't service that debt as a function of declining revenues, as it was a largely print business. And so I thought, well, I had this really nice job at Time Inc., and why don't I throw it out the window and see if I can do something here. And so in 2010, with a private equity firm, we acquired Ziff Davis, which at that point was 60 people and 1 title, PC Mag, and that was it. And today, the company does $1.5 billion of revenue, $550 million of earnings. It's a public company. We have 4,700 employees. So we've seen, and it's a fully digital company. And so we've seen both sides, I think, of the equation. I've seen what technology can do destructively, but then what it can also do constructively. And so today, the portfolio, we have 40 different brands, mostly media, some software, which we can talk about. I see some connections between media and software. But in the tech space, it's PC Mag and it's Mashable. In the health space, it's Everyday Health and it's Baby Center and it's What to Expect. In the video gaming space and entertainment, it's IGN. So there's a bunch of different brands that we have acquired really over the last decade. So this has also been a story of acquisition. But, hopefully, I think, a good story for how you can have a thriving business in the digital media space.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that in a little bit. But first of all, I should point out, by the way, that Vivek is on the board of the Newmark School, which is a complete coincidence.
I'll
I
look
found
into the alcohol policy.
That was my next sentence. Yeah, you really need to change that. I mean, can we have a motion? Right. Funny. You know what I really like about this format, actually, is when I realized things I forgot to say up here. So one thing I also forgot to say was to really thank Mike and Peter and Britt as well for endeavoring to put this event on, because as you heard, it wasn't easy, and particularly Mike was kind of my point person. Working with him over the years, we were trying to do this during COVID and couldn't make it happen. So thank you guys very, very much. Really, really appreciate that. Ben, back over to you. You know, you had a really awesome run as the media critic at the New York Times. We'll talk about BuzzFeed in a minute. But the media critic thing was, no, that was good too. We could talk about that. But the media critic thing, I mean, you were a must read. And, you know, I think you had people shaking in their boots when Ben Smith called up. And you really, you know, uncovered some stuff. So what was that like? Why did you leave to do this? I mean, that's like an incredible job. Who wouldn't want to be the media critic at the New York Times?
Yeah, it was really fun, and I kind of miss it. I mean, it is a weird job because you're like just punching your friends in the face once a week, and and at some point you either become some kind of like weird Gollum character, or like you have to lay off a bit, I think. And so I didn't come in thinking that this was something I would do forever, but honestly, I was really loving it, and just the kind of opportunity to do this, in the sense that I don't know, that the winds are changing really dramatically in news. It's a new moment. There are all sorts of, I mean, particularly around trust, you know, the notion that people connect with and trust individual journalists, and it's over brands. I mean, there's just like, you know, Sam is here doing that. Like, there's a lot changing in the business, and I guess having this front row seat to it, have been talking to Justin Smith, my partner, and, you know, distant cousin, for a long time, and just felt like this is a really good moment to start something new.
Right. Can I ask you about Elon and Twitter, and what's your latest take on that, Alyssa? I mean, it's like, just talk about a guy who takes all the air out of the room, right? I mean, you know, I was doing an interview with Mary Barra, and said, you know, how do you compete with Tesla when Elon can just say anything and no one cares what you say at all? At all. You're running General Motors and no one cares because some guy's talking. But what do you think about him with Twitter?
I think when I'm feeling a little bit trolly, I suggest that Elon is just in the meme stock business now. But for the Times column that you're referring to, I wrote, they asked me to write about what would happen to Twitter if he loosened, you know, moderation policies. And so they wanted a column about harassment on Twitter, which I'm, you know, equipped to write. I'm on the receiving end of it pretty regularly, especially when I write about Elon. But I wrote a column that was essentially about why I didn't understand the business rationale behind it. Because I think if you turn Twitter into, I use the word cesspool, you end up alienating much of the growth audience. When Trump got kicked off Twitter, user signups went up by 21%. So now he's bringing Trump back to Twitter. So, you know, are some of those people going to leave? We don't know. But also there's a liability factor. Twitter makes most of its money off of advertising right now. And having been also, you know, the editor-in-chief of a couple of publications and been a publisher myself and been in ad sales meetings, my experience of that is that advertisers are very shy about even wanting to be next to hard news. You know, they don't want to be next to controversial political stuff. So if you completely treat Twitter as a free speech absolutist platform and you allow hate speech on the platform, you allow endless harassment, I think you kill off your growth strategy, and also you destroy your existing revenue streams. So, and when people have asked him explicitly what he wants to do with Twitter, he's been a little bit evasive, because I don't think that he's really thought it through that much. When they've asked him about free speech policies in other countries, he said, well, I think Twitter should adhere to the law of whatever country it's operating in, which has particularly interesting implications for China. So that's kind of where I stand. I don't envision that he's going to be a better operator of Twitter. I understand why a certain kind of free speech absolutist libertarian is excited about him being there, but if I were a shareholder, I would be concerned. So.
Yeah, and then there are the financials, which I think are, you know, there's been a bunch of stories on those, and it's very, very interesting. I've talked to some bankers about it, and it's not a straight shot at all. It's somewhat of a traditional deal, I think this person was telling me, but it's a complicated, tricky one. Maybe you know something about that stuff. No? Okay. I want to ask you, though, about your business model and how applicable that is, and you sort of alluded to this, Vivek, how applicable this is to different types of news organizations. I mean, could the New York Times do what you do, or how is what you do different from the New York Times' P&L? Is it any different?
Well, I mean,
Where do
there
you-
are
where do you get your
differences,
revenue?
and by the way, the New York Times is doing exceedingly well as a company, and I think they've executed really wonderfully. I mean, if you think back sort of 10 years ago, I don't know if people would have thought that would have happened. But, so I think there are a lot of different ways, right? I think there are a lot of different models and different ways to look at essentially financing content, right? So that is what my job has been for 25, 27 years, which is to find a business model for content. And when we were working together, it hit me early that the consumer side of the equation, what the consumer was willing to pay, whether it was single copy sales or subscriptions, was challenged. Even in those days of Fortune, which was a thriving business, it was thriving largely through the advertising revenues. It's factual. In fact, I remember studying the circulation P&L, and it's essentially a break-even proposition, and the reality was we were using payment for subscription as a proxy for wantedness and demand for the product to convince advertisers, which is why you didn't do controlled at the time, right, meaning free distribution. Well, if someone's paid for it, it must be worth it. Now, look, so we knew that advertising was the straw that, stirred the drink, so to speak. And I think that's not the case in all categories, but I think in a lot of business categories that is absolutely the case. And if you think about advertising, probably the greatest ad machine ever created was Google. And the reason the Google ad machine works is that there's a perfect match between ad content and what the user's looking for. It literally is, the ad is triggered by your query. You could not have more perfect symmetry. And I think content models where contextual, what you're reading or what you're consuming is of value to a marketer, that's where you can see business models thrive. So, for instance, I'll give you a small example in our world, but it's an interesting one. So we operate a news brand called MedPage. It's the number.
How's it spelled?
MedPage, M-E-D Page.
MedPage, okay.
So MedPage, Medscape are the 1 and 2 news sources for physicians. So you'd say, well, what's that about? Well, physicians are interested in biomedical news. They're interested in what's happening in the industry. And this audience, there are 1 million doctors in the United States. These 1 million physicians prescribe $200 billion of pharmaceuticals. Definitionally, the most valuable media audience in the world. No one thinks of it that way, but they are. And the days of pharma reps going into a doctor's office and dropping off stress balls and then some information on a drug doesn't exist much anymore, but there's still a need for pharma to reach doctors. So there's an example, right, where if you can reach a doctor with a news product, there's going to be some business model associated with it. I think where it gets harder is where it's a mass reach vehicle and now you're competing with other mass reach vehicles. At the same time, though, I think the whole interest-based advertising, everyone getting spied on and the ad looks like the thing that you just talked about and you think your phone's listening to you, that perfection in ad targeting, that's getting slowly dismantled. So in that sense, I think content has a really strong chance as the pendulum starts to swing back. But for the last 10 years, it's been data, it's been collecting information about your browsing activity to inform ads run on large-scale social platforms. That's where the money has been going. I think what Apple's done with IDFA changes that, ID for Advertiser, which disables that, where Google's going with Chrome and deprecating what's called the third-party cookie, the instrument that's going to track. Those things make that business model harder. Facebook's US ad revenue in Q1 was up 1%. That's astonishing. This is a business that's been growing like a weed. And there's a reason for that. Yes, we say supply chain, negative GDP. Those are all real. But this change in privacy may favor content.
You know, some of us are thinking right now, we kind of prefer the days when the ad sales people would play golf, get money, there'd be blow-in circulation cars, and the trucks would deliver the newspapers and the magazines. But now we got this stuff.
Yeah.
It's long gone. I've got maybe one more question. Do we have some questions? Yeah, okay. Ben, let me ask you a question about the Steele dossier and how you feel about that now. And there was a story about the Steele dossier in the Wall Street Journal this week even. It just lives on as a story. And you guys know that as the editor, he published it.
The question is how I feel about it?
Yeah, how do you feel? I mean, because some people would say, oh man, I bet Ben regrets doing that, for instance. Do you regret doing that?
You know, no is the basic answer to that. I mean, I think that with perhaps a little bit of a caveat, which is, you know, our logic for publishing it then, and, you know, which we wrote at the time, was just that, and I think the context was actually important, and you guys know it, I assume people know what the Steele dossier was that it had been, at that point, passed around Washington to the point where, like, everybody except for the public had read it. And you knew that because all sorts of really important public figures were making decisions based on it. John McCain, Harry Reid, James I mean, there was, and in fact, things were happening in Washington that were inexplicable, if you, like, particularly politicians backing away from Trump in a certain way that were really hard to understand if you didn't know it existed and if you weren't allowed to talk about it. And so I think a lot of newsrooms were sort of we're trying to figure out what to do about that. And also, and meanwhile, like us, we're sending reporters to Prague and to Moscow and trying to run down and stand up or knock down the claims. But the document itself had started to, like, really have a lot of effect. And it was this sort of dark matter of Washington. And then, I mean, what sort of prompted us to publish was that CNN and Jake Tapper went on the air and said, there's this super secret document. It's been briefed to not one, but two presidents of the United States. And it says that the incoming president's been compromised by the Russians. I mean, the idea that, and I think that when you really think that through, like, you know, regardless of the sort of broader question of should a document like that ever be published in an ideal world, the world where you have CNN reporting, well, I have this secret document, it says the president's being blackmailed, but I can't show it to you, just isn't really a tenable situation. I think when people think it through, they kind of realize that.
That's really interesting context.
That's one thing. That said, one sort of technical thing that I do think about sometimes, we published it with a pretty forceful disclaimer saying, you know, we have not been able to stand up or knock down most of the claims. There's a couple details that are wrong. Caveat emptor, we're publishing it because it's important. That was a web page. We linked to the PDF. In retrospect, I would have stamped that all over the PDF, I think.
Right.
Because they sort of traveled separately.
Yeah, I could see how you would think that. But yeah, and this has engendered a million debates and conversations in journalism schools and elsewhere. But you know,
yeah, I think they're less interesting in the specific than the abstract. Actually, I think when you think that through, like the idea that we were going to head full into that year, Adam Schiff and Duncan Nunes were going to be having this insane fight, but you weren't going to be allowed to tell anybody what it was about.
Yeah.
Like what? And it doesn't make any sense.
Questions? Got one here and then one there. We'll start with this gentleman.
First of all, congratulations, Andy. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
So my question is Ben alluded to it a little bit when he talked about the power of individual journalists right now in the marketplace. As we sort of trust them more, they have more visibility. You know, I know that, like, I didn't know most of the things that Elizabeth is doing, but I get her newsletter, which is great. Sam, I get his newsletter, that's great. We've sort of backed into this very classic distribution model of newsletters that used to be so strong and then kind of had this lull. And I'm curious what you guys think about the role of, you know, being an individual journalist as a brand in this thing. This has obviously been a huge thing at the Times, and you know, certain places more than others.
Do you want to take that first?
Yeah, so I wrote something about this. I think it's on Medium, and I titled it in a way that I knew would rankle some journalists. It said something like, why every journalist needs a personal brand. And I completely sympathize with people who hear the phrase personal brand and kind of feel like they want to vomit. But this was sort of pegged to an internal discussion that was happening in the Times around two reporters, Taylor Lorenz, who covers web culture, and Maggie Haberman, who, you know, it's a legendary Pulitzer Prize winning political reporter. And I sort of made an argument that even within institutions, there tends to be a kind of class structure where you can be a tenured journalist who has safety within the institution. And then you don't have to worry about your personal brand that much because the institution does it for you. You have a whole team of audience development people who will promote your work. You have some safety around what you do because in this case, the Times is protecting both of them. But, Taylor was younger, and she was very visible on the internet and on TV. And I think internally that was regarded as a little bit of a violation of manners because she hadn't earned it or, whatever. But Taylor didn't have the same job security that other people have. And so I sort of believe that most people who are journalists now do have to think about how their work lives in the world and how their byline lives in the world. And so I just suggested in the piece that you take out personal brand because I understand why it gives everybody the creeps, but and just substitute it with reputation because everybody understands that in journalism. And they understand it very deeply because I would argue, I've also worked in finance and tech and to some extent in politics more recently. I feel like reputation is more currency in journalism than in any industry I've worked in. And it's extremely important. And so when you frame it like that, people kind of get it. And then when you frame it in terms of job security, they get it. So I guess it depends on where you see yourself in the ecosystem. If you are the tenured person at the institution who's been there for a long time and you have other people promoting your work, then no, you don't really have to be on Twitter or think about these things. I think particularly if you're younger and you're starting out and you don't know what's going to happen to your job in 5 years, I think it would be highly not very pragmatic to pretend it doesn't apply to you.
Ben, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I think, on one hand, there's a just a broader trend that that institutions are losing trust and individuals are gaining it, and that's true of the Republican and Democratic parties, right, as well as of news organizations. And it's like, love it or hate it is a huge fact of the world, and it's true in all the media industries, in sports, in Hollywood. The power is shifting toward the player and away from the league, which is complicated. Is it good or bad? I don't know. It's a very complicated thing that isn't clearly good or bad. It's a fact of the world. And I think, I agree that journalists just recoil at the word brand. And I mean, actually, I heard somebody try to substitute, you think they don't like brands, try to substitute the word newsfluencer, which is worse. And if you can come up with, and it's not just reputation because it's your kind of persona in this contemporary landscape that's centered on social media. I don't know if somebody has a better word for it. I'm like, yeah, but like voice is like, you're a commentator, you've never done any reporting, I just want to hear my own voice. Like Substack's great for that, but I don't know. Like that's not, I'm not reading you because of your voice. It's like in spite of your voice.
I would argue you have a voice though, like in your reporting, your Times media column.
But
has a
yeah,
very
and I
strong
think,
voice.
my sort of, but I think there's a kind of reporting that where you break news, where you do try to have a bit of a voice, but where you lead with breaking news, and that, that actually I would say without, that's the reporter I'm trying to build a platform for, because I think Substack, which is amazing for analysis, is less suited for that. Anyway, complicated. Sorry, I could go on this topic for a while, but it's
so
an
someone
interesting
comes
question.
to you and say, I'm looking for a platform for moi, because I'm fabulous. Is Semaphore going to be? Are you guys?
If you can get,
will you have me?
if you can break news for me every day.
Yeah, right. Another question back here. There's shortcomings to algorithms. Those are your babies. Come on.
Yes. Why did
Your
you do that?
No, I'm straining to hear the question.
No, he
What's-
said, he was basically saying the algorithms are fallible, like he saw some.
Of course they are.
Right.
Yeah, no, but I'm not defending Google. I'm not here to defend Google, for God's sake. But it's indisputable. I mean, it's a very successful company. There are going to be all sorts of cases where the machine goes wrong, and there are cases where humans make errors too. I've been involved with those. Just on the last question, one thing I would say that is just one thing to think about: the power of being in someone's inbox is a big deal. You are outside of the platforms. You're not regulated by an algorithm. You can't get dislocated. If you have a direct relationship and permission to be in someone's inbox, and it's something you're excited to open every day or whatever that frequency is, I think there's power to that. So you mentioned that, and I think we all have them. There's a set of emails that you get on some regularity that when you get it, you're excited to open it. And then there's a lot of emails that you are not excited to open. And I think if you can be an individual or an entity, a brand, that can get into the inbox, I think that's valuable. And it's the one area where, we're using Gmail and things like that, but you're not getting dislocated. There isn't some algorithm that's favoring one thing over another. You're not worried about being on a homepage. You're not worried about getting promotion and all that kind of stuff. And look, no one creates content for it not to be read, for it not to be seen. So that direct, I think, is powerful. Yeah. I mean, that's a platform, right? But any and all of these platforms, I think, are good. I think trying to get into that. By the way, more than half of emails are open on your phone. It's mobile. Email's mobile.
Oh, we have some questions back there, and then you, okay? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so Andy, just kind of speaking to your point about how we're in 25 years of the internet, Netscape IPO 1995, a long time. What is the you mentioned the inbox. We have homepage. We have the homepage. What's 25 years ago, the way people consumed news on the internet was homepage. So the homepages were set up to be like a front page of the newspaper. So like when I write for MarketWatch, I'm still looking for that because I'm still old school. I'm still looking for my story on the front page, above the fold, even though the computer doesn't really fold. I'm looking for it above the fold. What's the most common way people consume news now? Is it through your Twitter feed? I'm wondering because people aren't going to the web pages as much, right? So are they're getting a lot of they're getting it principally through Google? Is it through your inbox? Is it on Twitter? I'm just wondering where the eyeballs are basically.
I think it's super interesting you're asking that question because it's so many other moments in media. It's been totally obvious. And I think you're asking it because it's not clear. I think it's much more fragmented than it used to be. You got to kind of meet people where they are. Different publications might find more of their audience from Facebook or from Twitter or from Google or from email. And I think it's actually kind of interesting that I don't think there is actually a straight answer to that question. I don't know, Vivek, am I wrong? I hope I'm not totally wrong.
I think you're right. I think that the thing that's changed, though, in most of those instances is if it is through Google, which is a huge source, whether it's Google News or Google Search or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and a lot of that is you're not getting traffic through it. You're getting your content in some snippet pushed through, but you're not actually getting any traffic to the piece that you may have written that's published on MarketWatch. You're still beholden to these algorithms and to someone else's system, which is hard. Direct traffic, which we all want, the person that types in marketwatch.com has it bookmarked, that's the holy grail. If you can have direct, the number of properties that get direct, small, and so then you're often looking, even, I'll actually say this, Yahoo Finance is, when I have all of my tabs, Yahoo Finance is one of my tabs that when I open my Chrome, I'll see it every single day. And so, but it's hard to be in that. I think if you can get into that, that's great. If you can be someone's destination, but not a lot of brands can do that.
And I would say not a lot of younger, I do that. I don't think my kids do that.
Oh, well, they're on TikTok. They're on.
Right, and they're on mobile, and it's just, so that's sort of a different,
Yeah.
it's a legacy behavior.
Right.
Well, first of all, I don't even know if they're getting news.
Yeah, kids never read. We always complain about kids not reading the news.
It's incredible. Just
They
incredible.
never have.
We have time for a few
Kids
more
were never
questions.
okay.
I don't really understand
Yeah. No, I mean,
That's by design.
okay. No. That one I can give you a straight answer to. I guess to answer your questions like in reverse order, yeah, I think you're right. Like there's always this pendulum between bundling and unbundling, and like the sort of email newsletter world has probably like maximally unbundled and will swing back toward bundles of different writers, and Puck actually is essentially that and is doing a pretty good job at it. Okay, I'm just because I I sort of said to Andy like I'm not really like I mean. I'm eager to talk about Andy, but since you asked, yeah, we're launching a new news organization centered on great reporters, putting them, I think, assuming that audiences are going to connect more directly with reporters who have an analytical take, but also know the difference between their news and their opinions, which I think is a problem in the way a lot of American news is structured. It's kind of parochially American and like very sort of dug into a set of arguments that are really like basically the reporter's view, and maybe you're interested, but you might want to know that the reporter knows the difference between, like, and this is what I sort of try to do in my column, like, here's a scoop, here's my take on it, you know, we can disagree on the latter part. So in some sense, that's what I'm trying to do in you know, politics and tech and business and some other spaces. Gosh, there was another question in there. Oh, why leave the Times? I don't know. I mean, I guess my experience of this industry, maybe to a fault, has been like jumping from melting ice flow to melting ice flow. And not that the Times is a melting ice flow, but I do think the Times, and as my first column I wrote for the Times, like it kind of like in this, you know, as the sort of my generation of digital media, because I was at Politico and then at BuzzFeed, you know, went through a really difficult cycle. The Times kind of like sucked all the people I'd been competing against, Ezra Klein and Kara Swisher and all these people, Corey Sika, like all worked for the Times all of a sudden. And you know, it's more fun to, you know, be in the Rebel Alliance than on the Death Star, ultimately. And safer in the end.
I remember that was your first column at the Times, basically,
Yeah.
right? When you first joined it, that's what you wrote, which is like, whoa. And I remember, I hope I'm not talking out of school, but you said you also miss running a newsroom.
Yeah, and it's also the grass is greener. Like when you're running a newsroom, you're like, I just want to be a reporter, and then you're like, I miss that. So some of that too.
Okay, we'll revisit this 10 years from now, right, or whatever. Did you have a question, Dan? Or
Sure,
yeah.
yes. First of all, congrats again, Andy.
Oh, thank you.
You know, half of this room works with Andy, and he is very fun to work for. It's true.
Oh.
As you said, it is, you know, it does matter approaching journalism from a fun perspective. It can be fun. So just kudos on a great career. You know, you guys were talking about newsrooms. I thought this might be a fun question, maybe more like a prompt, but a fun question for a lot of the people in the room too. And maybe some of the people in the room are still, you know, every day they go into a newsroom, so a lot of the people might not know this, but in many, many ways, and it's almost interesting that the pandemic hasn't come up much during the panel, but now, and I think this was already happening, but now the pandemic really accelerated it, so many newsrooms are just digital only. There is no physical newsroom. And I mean, you know, Elizabeth, you were at the Observer, you were at the Times, Fortune had a great newsroom, Yahoo Finance still has a newsroom. I mean, I'm a believer in that there's great value in going into the office, you know, and you're with your colleagues, especially when there's big breaking business news. You know, a stock is tanking, what's happening? The earnings came out, they're shit. You know, everyone, all hands on deck. You can talk to your colleague. And nowadays, so many sites and media orgs, at the end of the day, it's a lot of young green reporters who are alone in their apartments. And so there's appeal of the, you know, remote work revolution.
And depressed and sad middle-aged editors.
Well, sure. I mean, no, but I mean, for some of those people, depending on age or your circumstance in life, there's great appeal in working from home. But I think what's tough is for a lot of these young kids who are like 25, 26, 27, that, you know, there's a great social appeal that is lost from just being at home alone every day. And I'd just be interested in your take on, you know, the rise of the remote work revolution as it relates to the loss of the in-person team newsroom.
I mean, I also wrote a column about this for the Times. And I said, basically, my thesis was that, and I'm generally a fan of remote work, but there are some losses, especially for younger workers, because they're not around people, they don't get the same modeling, it's harder for them to advance in a very structured way because it's very easy in a remote situation to load more work onto people without the requisite advancements that you would expect. That said, I've seen, it really depends on the publication. My husband's the editor-in-chief of a real estate trade called Inman News, and they've always been remote, way before pandemic, because they needed reporters in different parts of the country, and they couldn't hire a giant newsroom, but they needed around 15 reporters. So there was no way to put everybody in the same newsroom. And so they sort of figured out how to do it via a combination of Zoom and Slack way before the pandemic. And when they need to see each other in person, they also host, the company hosts events, and so they do get together periodically. And I've watched them do it really successfully for now 5 years. I think it's a lot harder if you're in a hard breaking news operation because, I think that really, the office time makes a difference. But, if we're looking at the whole landscape of journalism, I really think it's publication specific as to whether you need it or don't. So.
You guys have any thoughts on that? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's funny because there's something I'm pretty agnostic on. I mean, I also, like, as somebody who has no boundaries between work and life, of course, all my friends were my colleagues, and, like, I would have had to make different friends probably. But I think people are pretty adaptable, and, if you are trying to be global as we are and to have different perspectives, it's a huge advantage to not have everybody in the same city. And it's also just if you're trying to recruit the best people who come from different kinds of backgrounds and different places, you just have a much larger span of people if you're not insisting that they commute to Manhattan every day. And so that's sort of my big picture philosophy. What I've also found is that when you're starting a new thing with a bunch of strangers, incredibly important that you're in the same room. I think once you get to know each other, I do think there are a lot of models for, really making sure that you're seeing each other in person from time to time. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is society's kind of adapting around it. But obviously, you'll miss the drink cart.
Wow. Well, the drink cart. That brings
I will.
many of us way, 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 way back. The way back machine.
BuzzFeed was big on the drink cart. It was our
Seriously?
inheritance from Time Inc. I don't know.
Oh, that was borrowed from Time Inc. Very
Also,
much so.
I had fortune. I feel like it was a religious experience to walk past Carol Loomis's office and just kind of peer in.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
This
absorbedly.
person actually is
Yes.
doing their great work.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Overhearing people on the phone is awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
You learn a lot from, I learned so much from listening to Maggie Haberman talk on the phone. Just I didn't know you could talk to people like that.
Right. Yeah. All right. I think we need to wrap things up. So please join me in thanking Elizabeth Spiers, Vivek Shah, and Ben Smith. Thank you guys so much.
Congratulations, Andy.
Thank